Spartacus, a gladiator, led the largest slave revolt in history. He ran away from the army and stole from people, but he became a military genius and led 70,000 slaves into battle against the Roman Empire. Spartacus started at gladiatorial school. Lentulus Batiatus ran a school for gladiators in Capua, which was 150 kilometers south of Rome, in the year 73 BC. At the school, he had at least 200 gladiators. They were slaves and war prisoners who had to fight each other in the amphitheater of Capua to entertain the people of the city. When they weren't fighting in the arena, gladiators trained at a school where they were locked up and treated like prisoners. In the summer of 73 BC, about 20 of them ran away from school and started the biggest slave rebellion ever. Plutarch, a Greek and Roman historian, said that only 72 men were able to fight their way out of the school using weapons like meat knives and skewers that they got from the school kitchen. Fleeing through the city streets, they were lucky. They found some carts with gladiator weapons, which were to be transported to another city. After getting these weapons, it wasn't hard for the gladiators to fight their way out of Capua. Every third person was a slave. In the year 73 BC, the Roman Empire reached from Spain to Turkey and from the Alps to the Sahara. The center of the empire was the peninsula of Italy, which had Rome as its capital. Modern historians say that 1/3 of the people living in Italy were slaves that the Romans got during their wars and conquests. Most slaves were forced to work on large farms or ranches, where they grew crops or herded cattle and sheep. Other slaves worked as servants, gladiators, or miners, among other jobs. Spartacus was a hired soldier. Outside of Capua, the gladiators stopped and chose Spartacus as their leader. He was a Thracian, a group of people who lived in what is now Bulgaria and northern Greece. Appian, a Greek historian, said that Spartacus was a freeborn Thracian who volunteered to join the Roman army's auxiliary troops. Spartacus probably ran away and lived as a thief, but he was caught and made to work as a slave as a punishment. At least he was taken to an Italian slave market and ended up in Batiatus' school for gladiators. After picking Spartacus as their leader, the gladiators fought off Roman soldiers sent from Capua to catch them. The group of rebels then ran south to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, where they set up camp. Along the way, they stole goods and slaves from farms and set them free. Many slaves joined the rebel bands because they wanted to be free, steal from planters, and get back at those who beat them. A 3,000-person Roman army was sent to put down the rebellion. The army was mostly made up of Roman civilians who worked together as a militia. Old sources say that the rebels' camp was in a hard-to-get-to place near Mount Vesuvius. That is, the Romans had to go through a narrow path to get to the camp. Instead of attacking, the Romans set up camp below the passage and let the gladiators and slaves starve to death. Plutarch says that the rebels climbed to the top of the mountain at night and then used intertwined vines to climb down the other side. Then they went around the mountain, attacked the Roman camp from behind, and beat the army. This was the first time Spartacus had been smarter than a Roman army and won, but it was just a small group of people. The majority of Roman legions were in places like Spain, Greece, and Turkey. The Senate didn't like what was going on. The consuls and senators who ran the Roman Empire thought the rebels were a bad group of slaves and gladiators who were not worth fighting. So at first, the Senate did not take the rebellion seriously enough, and the rebels could move around southern Italy without being stopped. Tens of thousands of slaves who had been freed or had gotten away joined them. On their way, they stole from, raped, and killed Romans. Only in the fall of 73 BC did the Roman government's top leader, Publius Varinius, take charge of 2 legions of about 10,000 soldiers and send them after the rebels. Spartacus, who was a great soldier, struck again. Spartacus has now shown that he was good at military strategy. He didn't want to meet the Romans in the open on a battlefield. Instead, he pulled back. In order to catch up with the slaves, Varinius split his army up into groups. The lead group of 2,000 soldiers got too far away from the rest of the army. When Spartacus saw the mistake, he turned and hit the Roman front line. Shortly after that, he surprised another Roman army unit while its leader, Caecinius, was at a bathhouse in a small town. Only now did Spartacus attack the weakened main Roman force, defeating them. Varinius barely got away, and then asked the Senate in Rome for help. The rebels now controlled southern Italy. They stole from many cities and took over the port city of Thurii, where Spartacus trained his slaves for war and had weapons made during the winter. The army had grown to 70,000 people, including some women, children, and older people. A Gaul named Crixus was one of the people who worked for Spartacus. He couldn't stand going through military training. In the spring of 72 BC, he went on a plundering expedition with several thousand men. At the same time, the Senate put together a force of 40,000 soldiers to fight against the slaves. Most were sent to fight Spartacus, while the rest went after Crixus and beat him on Mount Garganus on the east coast of the peninsula. Crixus was one of the people who died. Spartacus went north toward the Alps and beat 2 Roman armies there. He wanted to get the slaves out of the Roman Empire so they could go back to their own countries. Many of them were Gauls and Germans from what is now France and Germany. Others came from places like the Balkans or the East. But the slaves talked Spartacus out of crossing the Alps. Instead, they persuaded him to keep plundering in Italy. Their many wins had given them a big head, and they became overconfident over time. The army turned around and headed back south. Meanwhile, the Roman politician and general Licinius Crassus had gathered an army of 50,000 men in pursuit of the slave army. After some clashes, Spartacus retreated to the peninsula of Rhegium, Italy's too, and from here he would cross the strait to Sicily with his army. Spartacus wanted to establish a free state. Some historians believe that Spartacus wanted to create a free state for escaped slaves on the island and continue the war against Rome from here. Some people think that the slaves thought it would be easier to get away by sea. Pirates from southern Turkey would sail Roman prisoners out of the Mediterranean Sea in exchange for money. Spartacus paid some pirates to cross the strait with his army, but the pirates tricked Spartacus and the ships never came. Crassus cordoned off the peninsula by building a 35-mile-long rampart and moat with wooden towers and palisades from coast to coast. Crassus wanted to starve the slave army to death. The slaves tried to break through the wall several times, but each time they were stopped. They also tried to cross the strait to Sicily on wooden rafts, but the current was too strong. In the winter, when there was a blizzard, the slave army finally broke through the wall and ran toward Brundisium, which is in the heel of Italy. Here slaves tried to steal ships, but they were too late. Roman forces from Greece had landed in the city. At the same time, legions from Spain that had been sent back had made it to central Italy. At Neris Lucania, where most of the slave army was, Crassus caught up with them and beat their main force. Spartacus was one of the people who died fighting. According to the historian Plutarch, 5,000 slaves managed to escape, but they run into the Spanish legions and were regularly slaughtered by them. About 6,000 more slaves in the army were also caught. They were all crucified along the Via Appia road between Rome and Capua. The Romans never did find the body of Spartacus. Some of his men may have taken him to a secret place and buried him there. This brings us to the end of this video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. Also, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.